Today we're looking at radio and movies of the 1920s. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, don't forget to check out dailybellringer.com, where you'll find more resources that go with many of the Bellringer videos. The 1920s was a decade that saw a huge increase in mass media, or in other words, forms of communication that could reach millions of people. Up until the 1920s, the major mass media were books, newspapers, magazines, basically anything that is print media. But with new inventions and innovations in the early part of the 1900s, new media became available to Americans. The idea of transmitting sound or messages wirelessly had been around since the 1870s and 1880s, but it wasn't until 1895 when Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi developed the first wireless system to transmit messages. Then, in 1900, inventor Reginald Fessenden, while working for Thomas Edison, was able to successfully transmit the first audio message over the radio. Then, as is so often the case, war pushed greater technological developments, as during World War I, radio communication became vital to getting messages to troops. Technology development during the war would lead to the first commercial radio station being established. On November 2nd, 1920, radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, made the first commercial broadcast. More and more Americans began to purchase radios. In 1923, less than 1% of American homes had a radio, but by 1930, over 60% of American homes had radios. With the rising demand, more and more radio stations were established, going from just 30 radio stations in 1922 to over 600 stations by 1930. At first, these radio stations simply reported the news, but soon they wanted to reach broader audiences and began to feature music, comedy shows, and dramas. For the first time in American history, Americans began to gather around their radios in the evening during primetime hours to listen to their favorite shows. The radio also contributed to the growth of American fascination with sports. Prior to the radio, if you wanted to know what happened in a sporting event, you would have to go to the game itself or wait for a report in the newspaper. But now listeners could listen to play-by-play accounts of the games live. Radio made professional baseball players such as Ty Cobb, Lou Gehrig, and Babe Ruth into household names. Initially, many of these radio stations were locally owned and operated, reporting on local news, stories, and local events. But gradually, larger networks of radio stations were established. In 1927, the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, was established, and the following year, the Columbia Broadcasting Company, or CBS, was founded. Beyond radio, other new technologies captivated Americans and contributed to the growing mass media of the 20s. In 1888, French artist and inventor Louis Le Prince filmed the first motion picture of people walking in a garden. By the early 1890s, Thomas Edison's team of inventors had patented the kinetoscope, which improved upon the idea. By the 1920s, the technology of motion pictures had progressed to the point that viewing feature-length motion pictures became a popular outing for Americans. Movie theaters popped up in towns all across the United States, as the average American in the 1920s attended a movie at least once a week. This demand for theaters resulted in many extravagant theaters known as movie palaces being built. These early silent films drew huge crowds and made people such as Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Rudolph Valentino, and Colleen Moore into some of America's first movie stars. To keep up with the demand of moviegoers, more and more movies were filmed. In fact, the 1920s was the decade in movie history that saw the most movies produced. During the 1920s, there was an average of 800 films produced each year. Today, that number is around 500 per year. Major movie studios such as Warner Brothers, Paramount, Columbia, and Disney Animation Studios were all established during the 1920s in Hollywood, California. Interestingly, Hollywood became established as the movie capital of the world rather by accident. If you recall, I mentioned that Thomas Edison had developed the kinetoscope and had patents on motion pictures. Therefore, Edison and his organization sued anyone making motion pictures that were not made through him. Edison was based out of New Jersey, and Hollywood, California was about as far away from New Jersey as you could get. So many studios began to produce films there to avoid Edison's threats of lawsuits. Silent films were popular throughout the decade, but in 1927, an extraordinary new film was released. The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, was released and was the first motion picture synchronized to sound. People called it a talkie, and the film drew huge crowds. By the early 1930s, all films had sound, and the era of the silent film was over. The decade of the 1920s saw the advent of these new forms of mass media. Both radio and movies would make a huge impact on Americans and usher in the eras of mass media that we are accustomed to today. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.